Right, so in the last couple of videos in this sort of dashboard series, we've created this layout with sort of sub-tabbing behavior, but as a few of you have asked for, this is not currently responsive. We have a few problems when we try to get down to mobile view. So what we're going to do in this video is actually make this responsive so that we have this kind of structure here with a collapsible sidebar below a certain width. We can also click this little button and have it collapse there. Now the style that we're going for here is one that Coda uses, where their sidebar, you can kind of click to open it up here and click there to hide it. And then this little guy is sort of like a floating, sort of, if I just make this page a little longer, you can see that that little icon there is floating. So that's the basics sort of architecture that we're going for here. But just know, of course, there are other options too. If you have a look at Asana, always good to look at different sites for inspiration for your user experience. Their approach to this is actually having this hamburger icon that expands the sidebar sitting within the content of their page, rather than sort of the main content group, rather than, you know, in this approach, it's sort of floating off to the left-hand side there. Here it's actually inside the page, and if we click it, then the sidebar appears and we have that little close icon or hide sidebar icon inside there. So that's another approach. A third approach again is to use something like Twitter, where when their sidebar goes down below a certain width, it actually goes down to this kind of mini or narrow sidebar view. That's another approach you can use to save some real estate. And in fact, we're sort of at more of a tablet size here. If we go all the way down to more of a mobile size screen, then we're actually getting this bottom nav here. And actually also on Twitter, this profile favicon is actually what triggers the sidebar to appear. So that's another way of doing this kind of layout. So what we're going to be dealing with, as I told you, is that is this Coda one. If you are curious about how to do something like this, let me know in the comments below. I can add that to my list. But today we are going to deal with this kind of behavior here. So first things first, how do we actually kind of set up the basic architecture for this? Well, if you remember, let's just look at what we have. I'm going to open up this sidebar. We've got the floating group there on the left-hand side. That's our actual sidebar group. And then our main content group is over on the right-hand side here, which actually has all of our tab content groups inside. So the first thing that I want us to actually set up is, forgetting about the responsive behavior, let's just get this collapse expand behavior. And you can see that the main content group here is actually shifting. You know, as I click this, it's shifting here sort of to the right-hand side. And as the sidebar collapses, that main content group is expanding to take up the space that it now has to play with. So to set that up, let's start by actually adding our little collapse icon to the page. So I want it to be up here next to this logo image. So what I'm going to have to do, I'm going to right click on this logo and I'm going to put it inside of a row container. So we'll just call this sort of sidebar top. And if I make sure that we don't want a minimum width and we don't want to fit width to content, then that little row group is going to expand the width of the sidebar there. And now I am able to actually drag an icon into this group. And the icon that we're looking for is actually within this material icon library by Google, which very handily is available as a plugin that you can install to give you access to the whole library. And the one that we're actually looking for, the specific icon that we're looking for, is deceivingly called menu open. So that's the one that we're after. And because this is just a small little icon, we don't need the icon itself to be responsive at all. I'm actually gonna have a fixed width and height for this guy, so 24 pixels each. Make sure that I am centering it here within this group. And then we of course want it to sit snugly against that right border of this row group. So I am going to choose on this group sidebar top, the space between layout. Now, what we're actually after here is when this icon is clicked, we kind of need two things to happen. We need this sidebar to collapse, and we need this main content group to adjust its sizing to take up the space left by the sidebar. So there's kind of two different behaviors that are needed. What we are not going to use is a workflow to achieve this. So that'll quickly get complicated when we want to display these groups in their original form again, or when we actually have our responsiveness logic built in. There's just going to be too much to account for in terms of actions that we need to kind of capture all the associated logic with all of those possible scenarios. You know, sidebar open, but page is collapsed, all that kind of stuff. So what is going to be easier for us is if we set a variable, so to speak, or in bubble terms, a custom state, essentially just some piece of information that this sidebar and this main content group can look to and can see what is the current state, or what is the information in that container. And to make that more concrete, we're looking for a container which is essentially, is the sidebar visible or not? Or is the sidebar visible mode, you should think of it sort of like it's like a switch that we're setting, is that switch set to visible or invisible? And depending on whether it's visible or invisible, then the content on the page is going to react. So it's sort of like a traffic light. You know, when the traffic light turns green, we're not telling each car individually. We're not pushing the rules to those cars to tell them to go when the traffic light turns green. Rather, the cars are reacting to the traffic light, right? If we had to tell the cars to all go when the traffic light turns green, that would be a lot of rules, right? We'd have to have a workflow for every single car, or we'd have to loop through all of the cars to tell them to go. Like, it would just be quite complicated. So what would be a little bit easier is if all the cars just had a rule baked into them that cause them to react whenever the traffic light turns green. So that's kind of a silly analogy, but the way that we want to kind of think about baking in these kind of rules. And so the rules that we actually want to bake in here are going to operate around margin settings. So essentially going to use margin to pull this group off the page and to pull this group into the leftover space. So to set this up, what we want to do first is to set the equivalent of that traffic light, okay? The single point of reference for all of these elements. So we're going to set that as a custom state on the page, okay? So we're going to call that sidebar visible. And that's going to be a yes or a no field, which we are going to default to yes. Okay, we're predominantly expecting our users to be on desktop when they're viewing this, so the sidebar should be visible. So that's going to be the custom state. And then one of the ways that we change the state, where we change the traffic light from green to red, is when this icon is clicked. So I could just add a workflow here, which is going to say, okay, when the icon is clicked, then we're going to set the state for that sidebar visible container. We're going to change the value to no. Okay, so far so good. Now what we want is logic for the content on the page, i.e. this sidebar and this main content group, to react. So at the moment, right, the default behavior is when the sidebar is visible. So right now they're both using the rules, the properties that they would have when the sidebar is yes, when the custom state here is yes. And that's because that's the default value, right? That's the default value as we set it here. So now we kind of need to set the inverse. We need to say, okay, well, what about when it's set to no? So to do that, we're going to go into the conditional tab for each of these elements that are reacting, right? Each of the cars sitting at the traffic light. And we are going to bake in here some conditional statements and conditional logic. So we're going to say, okay, well, when we're going to pull out that custom state. So that custom state's living in the page, which is called dashboard collapsible, just for demonstration purposes. That's the name of the page here. So when that custom state, sidebar visible, is no, okay, then we're going to do something different. Specifically, what we're going to do is we are going to add some left margin. And traditionally, of course, left margin is going to increase the space between the left margin of this sidebar here and everything on its left-hand side. So it's actually going to push everything over to the right, but we want to pull everything over to the left. And so what we're going to do is use negative margin to get the inverse behavior there. And how much negative margin? Well, 280 pixels, which is the width of the sidebar. So if we move it off screen 280 pixels, well, then it's going to disappear off of the screen. So that left margin will go negative 280 pixels. And let's just test that out to start with. Let's just see, does that actually work as we would expect? So I click that, there it is, off the page, beautiful. I think I can see a little bit of shadow, which is pouring over. So we'll also, it's pouring over kind of just beyond the horizon. We're still getting some shadow expanding into our viewport. So what I'm gonna do is underneath the box shadow style, I'm just gonna set that to be none as well. So we turn that shadow off. Now we can do a similar conditional rule to move this main content group over to inhabit that space. So to save us some time, I'm going to copy this condition that we just created by right-clicking and going copy condition. You want to do that sort of in this part of the UI, by the way. You don't want to go and copy expression up here. You want to copy the entire condition. And then on group main, we'll right-click and paste the condition. So now we're keeping that rule, and now we're just going to change kind of the specifics. We don't need to worry about the box shadow style because this main content group doesn't have one, but we do need to decide how much margin now are we going to give it. So let's just see what we have over on the right margin. Normally, it looks like we're actually using padding. So I'm not sure why we have that set up as padding. I'm going to set up as margin instead. So we've always got 32 pixels between the main content group and the edge of the page here. And we now just want to replicate 32 pixels on the left-hand side when the sidebar is not visible. So I will change this left margin to be 32 pixels, remembering that, of course, normally it's 312 pixels. That's how we set it up in kind of the first video of this series. And so now if I click this, you can see that main content group is taking up the space. Beautiful, beautiful. Now, how do we get it to come back out, right? We need this kind of little hamburger icon here to allow us to toggle the sidebar back into view. Okay, so you can see here that I am able to scroll up and down in the main content group. If I collapse this, that floating hamburger icon is kind of fixed in place. So that's giving us a clue that we're gonna use a floating group for this. So I am going to, just for simplicity, I'm going to just toggle off that floating group sidebar in my elements tree. And I'm going to come down here to a floating group, and I'm just going to drag onto the page. Right, so this is going to be our floating group, let's say expand sidebar. The container layout, we could do this as a fixed. I'm actually going to set it to be aligned to parent, anticipating the fact that we're going to have this hamburger icon inside of it. It's kind of the single element that's going to be inside of this floating group. And so an align to parent will do us nicely. I'll just keep sort of the fixed width and height for now and add in our icon. So our icon, we're looking for the material icon, and specifically we are looking for an icon called menu. Easy enough. And we'll make sure that we're setting the size of this icon to be the same as our collapse sidebar icon. Okay, so that's looking okay. We'll actually put it in the middle. And now when it comes to the size of this floating group expand sidebar, let's, just so we can kind of see this, I will add just a flat sort of background color here, and I want to kind of make this little floating group constrict itself around the edges of this icon, and probably just give it a little bit of breathing room on each side, something like that. And then the last thing that we want to do just before we go and preview this is just align it to the right part of the page. So it will have the illusion of, this icon to collapse the sidebar is clicked, and it sort of turns into the expand one, right? It doesn't exactly, of course, if you're paying close enough attention, but it still looks relatively smooth from our user's point of view. So obviously want these two icons to be aligned in the same horizontal plane, so to speak. So let's just figure out how much we're working with here. If I hover over this little icon, it can be a little bit fiddly, but it looks like we've got 34 pixels between the top of this icon and the top of the screen. And so what I will do on this floating group sidebar, not on the floating group sidebar, sorry, on the floating group to expand the sidebar, I want to push this down, not actually 34 pixels, because that's going to go below, because remember we've got a little bit of padding inside. We've got 4 pixels of padding inside. So I actually want to go 30, and that should, I believe, line those two up. From the top of this, this icon is 34 pixels. And so let us see. So there it is on the page. If you know what, I am just going to, on our group main, I am going to just set a minimum height here of say 600 pixels. In fact, I will do it on group activity. I'll add a minimum height of 800 pixels, just so that we can scroll a little bit here. All right, great. So that looks like it's aligned. I collapse this. Excellent. Perfect, perfect, perfect. So that style is obviously not what we want for this little floating button. So what I will do is I will actually give it a flat white background. And then in terms of we want it to have a little bit of a shadow. So we've got the shadow defined on our sidebar. I should actually save this as a style, which I'll just call floating group, because that is literally what we are using here. And then I can select that same style. That's going to give a little bit of a shadow, which hopefully doesn't look too overbearing. I think that looks okay. The only thing is that it looks like the style has a transparent background, so we'll just give it a white background. And then of course, we don't want this little floating button to be visible all the time. We only want it to be visible when the sidebar is hidden. So I'm going to have this not visible on page load, and then add a condition which says that when, sort of remember we're going through via the custom state here, dashboard collapse force, sidebar is visible, right? This is the same as saying is yes. We can leave that as yes off. Then this element is visible. And we're having to attach that condition. So hang on. Sidebar visible is no. I'm sorry, that's what it should be. And we are having, by the way, to assign this logic, this conditional statement, to the custom state, as opposed to something like when, you know, that floating group sidebar isn't visible. Because the sidebar is actually still visible. We aren't hiding it. We are just faking the hide mode, so to speak, by moving it off screen. And there's a very specific reason why we're doing it that way, which we'll get to in a moment. But for now, let's just finish off this functionality by adding a workflow to this floating button, which is going to toggle the sidebar back into view. So I'm going to go element actions, set state. Where does that state live? On the page. What's the name of the custom state? Sidebar visible. What's the value? Yes. We are showing that sidebar again. So click this, disappears, opens back up. Wonderful, wonderful. Now, as to the question of why we are using a custom state as the traffic light here, as opposed to just saying, hey, when the sidebar is visible or not, we do need to use margin here to fake the hiding if we want to have this kind of smooth transition here, this kind of sliding off the page effect. If we just hide the group, Bubble doesn't actually expose the ability to have that nice transition. So how do we define that transition? We actually want to, on our floating group sidebar, we want to define a transition for each element that has its behavior changing in some way, has its state changing, has one of its properties being changed. So we define a transition here for the property that's actually changing. So in our case, it's left margin. And here we can define what kind of transition that we want. So let's use is in and out. That's kind of a nice one for getting this little transition here. And so if I click this, you can see that it slides now in and out really nicely. That's really looking good. And then of course we want to do the same thing for our main content group here. So for our main content group, we're obviously going to click on it and we are going to add a new transition. Again, it's going to be left margin. And again, we'll do is in and out. And now we're getting this nice sliding behavior. And in fact, you can see that the spacing isn't quite right here. This is far too close. In fact, we do need to, probably should give a little bit of a border to this element. So let's deal with that first. So I want to give a little bit of a border to this floating button, and then we'll deal with the spacing so that we're giving a bit more breathing room between the main content group and this floating button. So in terms of the roundness, I could go into my style and add, let's just add sort of 4 pixels. But because that style is being shared by this floating group sidebar, we're also getting that rounding here on the sidebar, which we may not actually want. So to get around that, it's going to be a bit of overkill to create a whole nother style potentially. If you had lots of these sort of buttons in your app, then yeah, I would actually say let's create another style. If it's just going to be a one-off like this, then instead what I would do is rather than coming off of here and define it down here, which essentially just is going to add a little bit more data to your application because Bubble has to load now all of these properties for this element as opposed to just picking them out from the style. What we can do instead is stick with the style, but then just make one small deviation from it by adding in some condition, like when this URL is not empty. So that's a condition that is always going to be true. Or you could say, you know, when the current date time is not empty, right? That's another condition that's never going to be false. So every time the page loads, this condition is going to kick in. And then we can just say, okay, well, what property do we want to change? So I think we would say the border roundness, we'll set that to be 4 pixels. And now we've got that flat sidebar as we expect and a little bit of a rounded corner here, which kind of makes everything look a little smoother. Then in terms of the spacing, so let's bump this up to, let's say 48 pixels. And if we're doing it for that left margin, then we also need that right margin, which doesn't change to be symmetrical. So we close this down. Okay, cool. So that looks a little nicer, a little bit more breathing room. Now, of course, the final thing that we have to do here, if I go into my inspect mode, which by the way, you can do just by right clicking and going inspect. I was just using a keyboard shortcut there. You know, what we want to do is basically we get down below a certain level and that sidebar is going to disappear automatically. And we come above a certain level and then it's going to expand automatically. So how we set that up? Let's first just deal with this random text that just is looking really kind of out of place here. Well, I'm saying fit width to content, which is why it is acting so weird. So there we go, that's looking a bit better. Because on fit width to content, it's literally just saying, hey, I want the width to be, you know, whatever this width is, you know, 500 pixels or whatever it is. And so we're not able to go below 500 pixels. So how do we get this behavior to work? Well, we can have a condition, we can have rather an event kick in, which is going to trigger the custom state, sidebar is visible, whenever the page gets below a certain page width. Okay, because remember, we already have the traffic light, so to speak, set up. And what we've also done is we've set up a way to trigger that traffic light. So to trigger it from green to red, we can click on these buttons. We can click on these little icons. But there's another way that we can trigger this traffic light. So we have to set that up. And that other way is, of course, when the page width changes. And by the way, I can see that I've got kind of I've got a corner, a rounded corner on each of the 4 sides where I might just want it to be on the top right and the bottom left. So if I wanted to change that, let's just go back into the style here and make sure that we're ticking define each border independently. That's not going to actually do anything to change visually what's happening, but it is just going to mean that when we change that particular roundness property for this floating group expand sidebar, we actually now have the ability to change the border roundness for each of those corners independently. So we want the top right to be 4, and we want the bottom right to be 4 as well. There we go. And now we're getting that look. So we were talking about getting the traffic light to set up that rule. So how do we set up this rule when the page changes? Then we want to essentially trigger some new behavior. Well, we're going to do that in the workflow tab. And we have a very handy event here called do when condition is true. So we can tick that, and we make sure that we're setting this to be every time. So every time this condition is true, this event is going to fire. And what's the condition? Well, it's when the page gets below a certain page width. Okay, so we have to decide, well, what page width do we want that to be? And so let's just open this up. We can kind of have a little look, and we can say, okay, maybe about here, or 960 is also a very common width. So let's just maybe keep it simple. Let's go 960. So when the page width is less than or equal to 960, okay, so when it hits 960 or it's below 960, then we essentially want the page to break. What we're doing here is setting a breakpoint, which is a point at which, depending on the page width, the content kind of changes in a fundamental way. It doesn't just continue gradually adjusting itself. It's sort of a clear demarcation point where we have a particular sort of step change in the way that the page appears. So for us, that is just hiding the sidebar. So when that current page width is less than 960, what we can do now, because we have that custom event set up, is just change the state. That's essentially like changing the traffic light from green to red, right? So we'll change that state again to be no. Let us see, we're at 1128 there. As I come down and we hit 960, there it is, it disappears. And we can open it back up again, and that's great. Now, if we want the ability, like as we expand outwards, we want that sidebar to automatically reappear, which you might not necessarily want to do, okay? You might want your users to have full control over that. But if you do want that behavior, whereas the page expands, that sidebar automatically appears, then we just add kind of the inverse condition here. So I'm going to right click on that event, right click paste, and do the opposite condition here. So when the page width is greater than 960, right, when it's 961 or above, then we want to set this to be yes. So we're changing the traffic light back from red to green in effect. And so let's see, yeah, there we go. We're below 960, we come back out, and now the sidebar appears. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Now, another little cleanup thing that we can do before we leave is we can see that if we're on a smaller page size and we click the sidebar, it constricts all of the content here on the right-hand side. That doesn't look that nice, right? Nicer is to have something like this in our reference page where when we click this, it just overlays, the sidebar overlays over the top of the main content group, okay? So how do we set that up? What we essentially want to tell this main content group to do is, let's see, at a sort of above 960, we collapse the sidebar, and this is the behavior that we want, right? The margin of this main content group is moving over to the left-hand side. Awesome. If we get below 960 and the sidebar is collapsed, then yeah, we want this main content group to over on the left-hand side. But if we're below 960 and the sidebar is visible, is not collapsed, then we don't want this margin to be set to 312, which is what it was set before. We want it to be set to be this 48 pixels of margin. So essentially need to write a rule here that says, I only want you to set your margin to be 32 pixels if the sidebar is not visible and if the page width is above 960, because if it's below 960, then I just want your margin to be set to be 32 pixels, no matter what. Okay, so how do we set that up in Bubble? Well, if we go into this main content group here, we've got this condition already, right? When the dashboard visible is no. The other time where we want the left margin to be 48 pixels is any time that the page width is less than 960, right? If the page width is less than 960, then this main group's margin should always be over here, okay? No matter what, doesn't matter what the sidebar is doing. So to write that rule, we simply say or, right? We have an or operator, or the current page width is less than or equal to 960, okay? And you might want to, if this is a very common breakpoint, you might want to, this is something we've talked about before, save this as an option set, right? Save this breakpoint as an option set so that you can reference it without having to manually type it in. And then of course, if you ever want to change that breakpoint in the future, you don't have to go into every, let's say we want it to be 880. We don't have to go into every individual place where we've manually typed out 960. We just update it within the option set in one place. But for convenience, we're just gonna kind of hard type it now. And let's see if this rule that we've written actually does hold up. So we're below 960 and our main content group is staying as it was. Excellent, that looks really good. One small detail, if we load the page on a page width that is less than 960, so let me refresh, okay, you will see that the sidebar appears there for a split second before it goes off the screen. Now, the reason why that's happening is because this sidebar is by default going to have its left margin set to 0. So when the page loads, right, that sidebar is just visible there on the left-hand side of the screen. There's a split second between when the page actually loads and when this condition kicks in, which is going to set the left margin to be negative 280. So you are seeing, when we see that kind of delay, what we're seeing is the page load first and then that condition kicks in and the margin changes. So a little kind of hacky way around that is just to add a pages loaded event, which is going to actually show that sidebar from an invisible default state. So what do I mean practically speaking? It means that for this floating group sidebar, we actually don't want it to be visible on page load. And then we have a workflow. When the page is loaded, what we do is we show that floating group sidebar. So it's a little bit of a hacky kind of workaround here, but what it means is that by default, right, that sidebar is not going to be visible. And by the time this action actually kicks in to show it, the margin's already off screen. Okay, the margin, the negative margin that's being kicked in by that condition has already been applied. So what we want to do is also do the same thing for that main content group, because you can see the sidebar is not visible, but that main content group is starting over on the right and then kind of expanding into that vacant space. So we want to do exactly the same thing for group main, where we say, look, I don't want you to be visible on page load, but I will show you in this workflow. And so then everything appears kind of where it needs to be. Now, that is a pretty hacky workaround. I can't necessarily guarantee that if you've got lots of stuff on the page and there's a lot of loading happening, this will work perfectly. In that case, you might want to add a little pause, or you might want to tie that condition to some other content that's loading that is going to take some time, and hide everything behind like a visual loading indicator. Or kind of in an ideal world, you actually have a view of this page that is the default for mobile viewers, right? Where you have like a specific sidebar like this one that is actually the default one that you load when your users are on mobile. Or a bottom sidebar like this, Okay, so it really just depends on your particular app, how much you want to kind of account for this little quirk in the user experience. You might decide that it's okay to just show that sidebar for a split second before it disappears, even on mobile size screens. So with that kind of little aside out the way, there we go. There is your very nice looking collapsible dashboard